So you are here for your session today, which is from imposter to empowered. I'm Heather Ryder. I'm an anxiety coach and an imposter syndrome educator, and I'm super excited to talk with you today about a topic that I am very, very passionate about because I personally overcame high functioning anxiety and imposter syndrome while I was working as a product manager in Austin. So some things that I'm going to provide for you today are a definition of imposter syndrome and tell you how that can show up in your life because imposter syndrome doesn't always look the same for every person. It actually appears in very specific ways. And sometimes people are very surprised to realize that it doesn't look the same way for every person and that some of the things that they are experiencing can be defined as imposter syndrome. And I do want to give you really concrete and tangible tools that you can implement into your everyday life to make progress against imposter syndrome, both the icky feelings that come with it, and then also there is a financial cost to having imposter syndrome. So that is one benefit to overcoming it. And I know that we have the Slack channel going on. If you would like to type questions, I'd actually like for them to be in the chat. I think that's going to be easier for me probably to see them. Okay. So of course, we want to thank our amazing sponsors. You can see those there. And so, as I was mentioning, I really want to give you a definition of imposter syndrome. So, when you have imposter syndrome, you feel like you are faking it or like you're a fraud. Like you don't know what you are doing and you're going to be found out. And people with imposter syndrome really are feeling like the successes that they have had, they got lucky. They didn't earn them. Either they just happened to be given the right project, they happened to get the right job. Maybe it was somebody that they knew. So their successes aren't attributable to them. And oftentimes, people with imposter syndrome, it's very external, right? They are feeling like other people have skills or abilities that they don't possess. And so there's this huge comparison that comes in with imposter syndrome. And it's like, oh, I don't deserve what I have. Other people deserve what they have, but I don't deserve what I have. I didn't earn this. And this feeling of like you're faking it or you're a fraud has really, really severe consequences because people with imposter syndrome are thinking, hey, at any moment, I'm going to get found out. And if I get found out, I'm going to be taken off this project, or maybe I'm going to be demoted, or I might even possibly be fired. So it can be really, really debilitating for people. And I do want to also mention that imposter syndrome isn't just feeling underconfident, because sometimes people are feeling like, well, maybe it's just low self-esteem or underconfidence, but that's not really the case. It's way more severe than that, as I mentioned. And also, imposter syndrome isn't a mental disorder, but it is a phenomenon. And as I mentioned, there's lots of ways in which it shows up in people's lives, but it is very debilitating and can affect people's mental wellness. And because it's so pervasive, it affects more than the work life. It often extends into other areas of people's lives. And a side note, imposter syndrome, while I'm talking about it today, I'm generally going to be applying it to your work life. This can actually apply to creative pursuits. So things that you're interested in outside of work. And sometimes imposter syndrome also affects people's parenting abilities as well, which is pretty interesting. So who is affected by imposter syndrome? Well, almost everyone at some point. So it's been estimated that about 70% of the US population has experienced imposter syndrome at some point. And here is the really big irony. Imposter syndrome is higher in high achievers. So people who are more successful are more likely to have imposter syndrome at some point in their career. It does seem like imposter syndrome is higher in women, especially in male dominated industries like technology. And if you think about this, this makes a bit of sense because women, up until fairly recently, career options, particularly in the 60s or the 70s, if you wanted to be a professional, where you could be a secretary or a teacher or a nurse, there weren't a lot of career options. So for women, moving into different industries is fairly new for us. And that's probably a big part of why we're having imposter syndrome. Also, imposter syndrome seems to be higher in minority groups as well, where they have experienced racism and have been literally told, you don't belong here. So, how does imposter syndrome show up in the work environment? So, people with imposter syndrome, because they're having this, oh my gosh, I'm faking it, I'm a fraud, I don't know what I'm doing. What this generally means is they're not going to express their ideas because they have such doubt about their ideas and the quality of their work. So, this means when someone has imposter syndrome, they're not going to share in a meeting. They just, keep themselves from speaking up. They won't ask questions of people that they work with because they think, hey, if I ask a question, that's going to show somebody I don't know what I'm doing. I already think I don't know what I'm doing. I don't want to show somebody else that I don't know what I'm doing. So they've got this fear of being found out, right? So they won't ask questions. First of all, people may not even apply for a job, just that alone, right? Like their imposter syndrome really holds them back for applying for jobs. But then when they have the job, they're not going to apply for promotions within an organization. They won't ask for raises or some other type of compensation. So, if you think about this, all of these things that I am saying, while they're very difficult for the individual, they also really affect the company because this means that the organization isn't getting the best version of the employee, right? The company isn't getting the most creative ideas or the best output. So, I want to share with you my own personal story because I think that you're going to find it really interesting, hopefully, but it also very much illustrates a number of key issues that come in when someone has imposter syndrome. So I lived in Austin and had a job in technology, and I left to move to Charlotte, North Carolina, where I lived for 10 years. And while I was there, I alternated between being a stay at home mom and between working as a school librarian. I have a master's degree in library and information science, and I had never ever thought that I would work in a school. It was just very conducive to work life balance with kids. But I'm sure you can figure out that school librarians do not make any money. And so I wanted to get back into technology and move back into Austin so that I could really have a sustainable income. So I moved back to Austin after being out of technology for 10 years, which obviously is a very long time to be out of technology where things really change very rapidly. And it took me about 5 months to find a job. And I went through almost all of my savings in that time. And I got a job really through the power of networking. And I wound up working for someone that I had worked with before I left Austin. So there I was. I had so much writing on this job. I had moved across the country without a job, had spent all of my savings, really, really persevering. And there I am at this job. And I was doing something that was brand new to me. And so I was filled with massive self doubt. Like, can I do this? I've been out of this for so long. And now I'm doing this thing that I had never even heard of before. And this person basically, took a chance on me and gave me this job. And so I remember one day I was sitting at my desk and typing away, and I had this incredible sensation that's very hard to describe, where I felt like I was in a movie. So I'm doing the work, but I felt like I was pretending to do the work, and it felt like this surreal sensation. And I thought, I don't know what's going on. It didn't make any sense logically. It was like, I know I'm doing the work, but I feel like I'm pretending to do this work. And why do I having this like almost out of body experience? So I don't know what I searched in Google because at the time I had not heard of imposter syndrome. I didn't know that that was a thing. So I typed something into Google's like feeling like I'm in a movie at work. I don't know what I searched. And this result comes back in the list and I see imposter syndrome. And I thought, what is that? That's weird, right? Because imposter syndrome, that's a really weird phrase. And so I open up this result and I look at it and I was like, oh my gosh, that's what I'm feeling. This thing has a name and other people experience this as well. And so there was so much comfort in knowing that what I was experiencing did have a name and that other people felt that way, because that to me let me know that I could do something about the way that I was feeling. And I actually did do something, by the way. I hired a life coach because I recognized how much that feeling that I was having was so pervasive that I needed to do something about it. Like I couldn't be successful, and I had so much writing on that job. So, if any part of what I just said at all about my story is something that you could relate to, if you could just type "yep" into the chat, I would love that. I'm having trouble seeing the chat. Just want to see for a moment. Yes. Yep. Okay. There they go. I knew somebody had to be feeling that way also, because this is extremely common. Yeah. Thank you for that, everyone. And so, as I mentioned before, I was sharing the story that there are parts of that that actually illustrate imposter syndrome. So, I wanted to kind of identify those. So, first of all, when people are experiencing imposter syndrome, how I said this isn't a mental disorder, but it's like a phenomenon. When I said I felt like I was in a movie and it was a really surreal sensation, what that is called is disassociation. So when we're having this like massive mental trauma come in for safety reasons, it's like we pull ourselves outside of our body. And that's a protection mechanism. And so that's what was happening to me. Other people will describe it as like, oh, I'm having an out of body experience. I've heard that a lot of the time. And then also, this is something that is very common when people start to experience imposter syndrome. They could be trucking along feeling really great, but then they start doing something brand new. And that's when imposter syndrome tends to escalate. They may feel really confident in the role that they have, and then they get a promotion, and then they have imposter syndrome. Or they're doing whatever it is that they're doing, but then they're given a brand new project within that role, and that's something new, and it's kind of stretchy, right? Which is a good thing, but that's when the imposter syndrome comes in. So those are things that I have heard repeatedly from people. It seems ironic. It's like the higher they get up in the career, they continue to experience imposter syndrome, and they don't understand why, because you think, well, I'm more and more successful, or I've achieved more and more, but it's very common because you're doing something new. Okay. So some other things that, oh, my screen just popped off there. Okay. Now I want to be able to help you identify the ways in which imposter syndrome might be showing up in your life. Because as I mentioned at the very beginning, this isn't the same for everyone. And so there's a woman named Dr. Valerie Young. She wrote a book called The Secret Thoughts of Successful Women. She researched lots and lots of high achieving women, and she was able to identify different types of imposter syndrome. So I want you, as I'm reading through these, to think about which one or ones apply to you. So there is the perfectionist. This is the person who feels like any mistake, even a small one, right, it equals catastrophic failure. And then there is the superhero. This is the person who does not take any time off. They just think, if I am not at work all of the time, then something's going to fall apart without me managing everything. They just work way too much. And oftentimes they feel like they have to be successful in every area of their life. It's not just work, it quite typically extends into their personal lives as well. Then there is the soloist. So this is the person who doesn't want to ask for help. I've already mentioned this. They feel like if they ask for help, they are going to be seen as inadequate or a fraud, so they don't ask for help. Then there is the natural genius. This is the person who just knows how to do things without ever having been taught them. So when they come up against something new and they don't automatically know how to do it, it brings in this massive self doubt and the imposter syndrome escalates. And then there's the expert. And this is the person who is constantly seeking out more certifications and trainings. And it's not because they just enjoy it or, they know that it will help further their career. It's because they feel compelled and almost compulsive to do it because they're trying to prove to themselves and others like, hey, look, I know what I'm doing. See, I have all of these certifications. So, as I was reading through those, I would love for you to put into the chat which type or types you think apply to you. Mine, by the way, really used to be the perfectionist. And then I would say, secondarily, I was probably the expert. And most people have a predominant type, by the way, one that tends to be the one that appears most often, but then they have a secondary one as well. And sometimes people are like, well, every single one of those is true for me. So thank you so much for sharing those. I'm going to look through the chat in a moment. But I want to be able to give you some really solid tips for what you can do about this. Okay. If you're experiencing imposter syndrome or you have in the past and are concerned about that you might experience it in the future. So the first one is that you have to recognize your imposter feelings when they surface. This sounds easy, but this is actually one of the most challenging things to do. We have about 6,000 thoughts a day, and a lot of them might just be like, the equivalent of squirrel. They don't mean much at all, but a lot of them are very sort of weighty. And we are having all of these thoughts fire off. And so it can be hard to distinguish sometimes when the imposter thought comes in, because it can be really fleeting, right? Like it comes in and then goes out. But if you want to tackle and address this awareness is really the crucial first step, because you kind of can't make any progress if you don't recognize when the imposter feelings are coming in. Another thing that I really want to encourage you to do is share with other people. When I was at that job, when I was experiencing imposter syndrome, I didn't talk about it with anyone. And I really wish that I had. Even though I found that article online, I didn't at that point, I guess, understand like how pervasive it was. This, as I mentioned, 70% of people have experienced imposter syndrome at some point. So if you know that, chances are if you share how you're feeling with somebody, they most likely have felt that way too. And there's a lot of reassurance in that. So I'm going to encourage you to just talk with a trusted person. If it's not at your existing company, maybe somebody that you have worked with in the past. And so when you're recognizing those imposter syndrome thoughts coming in, what you do is just catch the thought and observe it instead of engaging in it. So that basically means you acknowledge it, but that you don't think it to be true. You just notice it and say, oh, I notice that I'm thinking that about myself. I notice that I'm thinking that about my work. And when you acknowledge it, that can put it into perspective, because then you can decide, well, I don't have to make this true. I can just notice it and observe it and realize that your thoughts aren't you. Your thoughts are just thoughts. So some of these move in really into imposter syndrome types here. So if you happen to be one of the perfectionist types, which by the way, in all of the presentations I give, that tends to be the most common that people identify themselves as their first imposter syndrome type is the perfectionist. So if you are a perfectionist, you need to validate your successes and celebrate your achievements. Because people with imposter syndrome are super goal oriented, where they want to go is very ambitious, right? So to the perfectionist, wins seem very small, but they wouldn't be small to somebody else. they're only seeming small to you because you have imposter syndrome, but somebody outside might be like, oh man, that was a huge win. And you think it was nothing. Okay. So it's those milestone successes that you're looking for and you want to validate yourself for. And then while we would all love to get external validation from other people, from our colleagues or from our bosses, unfortunately, that doesn't always happen. And so you've got to be the one who is internally validating yourself, because really your opinion of yourself is more important than someone else's opinion of you. And recognize that you've got to see yourself as a work in progress. Again, someone with imposter syndrome wants to make these quantum leaps, right? But really, growth tends to be very incremental. So, you using that imposter syndrome experience that I had as an example, I said that I was a total newbie at what I was doing. And when I came into that role, I felt like I needed to be an expert. That wasn't possible. I can't have that quantum leap. So I learned a lot in that year and a half that I was at that job. And it was incremental over time. And when I did leave, I actually happened to really feel like an expert later when I went into my new role. And just as a side note, also, a beginner's mind is very valuable. So when you're in an organization and you're doing something and it's new to you, you see things differently than other people do who are very entrenched in it and have been doing it for a long time. And so having a beginner's mind can be actually very valuable because you can see things that other people can't because they have basically established biases. So you've got to practice just-in-time learning, right? And this is what I was sort of alluding to recently, just a moment ago about being the expert. It's like you can't learn everything all at one time, and you shouldn't, because that isn't necessarily efficient anyway. So you need to acquire new skills when the situation warrants. When you're coming up against something new, it's like, okay, what do I need to learn right now to be able to take the next step? And of course, practice asking for help instead of feeling like you should know everything already. Know that this isn't a sign of weakness or being inept. And from what I have found, people actually love it when you ask for help a lot of the time anyway, because that makes them feel really great about themselves and their knowledge. And it's also a good skill building opportunity for the other person, because when you have to explain someone to something else, that takes a different level of mastery than just knowing it. So if you think of it that way, you're actually helping somebody if they need to explain something to you. And this is one that I tend to think is super fun. It can be, is to personify the imposter. So if you know that that imposter is talking to you, you've worked on identifying it when it comes in and it's talking to you, you've recognized, hey, I'm going to listen to you, but that doesn't mean I need to believe you. One thing that you can do is really imagine that you are pulling that imposter out of you so it's external to you. And when you can do that, you can listen to it and acknowledge that you are hearing it, but you can totally ignore its opinion. And I encourage people to actually name their imposter. And people come with all sorts of crazy things that are fun. There's no right or wrong. So this way, when you hear the voice, you can be like, oh, somebody that I knew named it the something police. I can't remember. It was so it wasn't just like one person. It was like she had a committee of people that were the imposter talking to her. So then she could just be like, oh yeah, I hear you. It's great. You're showing up. Thanks a lot for your input. And then you don't listen. So we have just a couple of minutes. I'm going to stop sharing. I am going to look through, and this may be some help from the moderator if somebody has been, a lot of people have been direct messaging instead of chatting. If anybody has any questions right now, I have just a couple of minutes.
Yeah, I have not seen any questions come my way. So if you have,
Yeah, it looks like it was set up to direct message me. And Woody was saying that surprised that there are classifications of imposter syndrome. It is surprising, and that's why oftentimes people know that they feel out of alignment. They're not sure what it is, and they're not realizing that like, oh gosh, why do I feel like I have to get certifications over and over? It's because of imposter syndrome. Oh, there isn't a way to chat. You can only direct message, Laura said. Well, I'm going to I'm going to take this opportunity then to take some questions that other people have asked me at other times. And this has to do with one of them I'm just going to mention really quickly because I think this is an interesting one, is because of the pandemic, remote work has really brought up a lot of imposter syndrome for people who've never experienced it before. And a lot of people have taken new roles that they've never had before during the pandemic, and they're fully remote. And a lot of the companies are not fully remote companies. And so when people are starting new roles, first of all, as I mentioned, that can always bring up imposter syndrome, but this working fully remotely seems to be an issue for people because they're feeling like, who am I in this situation? Do I belong here? Because they're feeling oftentimes like their team knows each other already and they're the outsider who is coming in. And I think a huge part of that is that if the company really didn't have an established culture of working remotely, then that would mean that they don't really know how to onboard people in a way that they have onboarded them before. And so I think that that is an interesting way that imposter syndrome has really been showing up for a number of people. And then another interesting question that I got one time was somebody had, read a job posting. Let's say it has 10 things that this person was supposed to have, and he had 7 of them. And then he's taking this job and he's like, well, I don't know how to do X, I don't know how to do Y, and I don't know how to do Z, right? And so for him, that brought up massive imposter syndrome because he started out feeling like, well, I'm not really what they were looking for. They must have settled for me. And if we think about, job postings, I know we've all seen this before, like these job postings, there's like a unicorn. It's like, there's got to be only 5 people in the country who have that particular skill set. And are those 5 people like ready to like out looking or willing to leave their job? And so what I would encourage anyone to know is that, a job posting is a list of, dream of what somebody wants. And just because you don't have all of those, it does not mean that you are stepping into a role that you're not qualified for, that you're faking it. It means that they hired you because they believe that you can do the job. And if they really need X, Y, and Z and you didn't have them, then that's your opportunity to learn and grow into that. Okay. So have just a couple of slides left. So I, of course, would love to connect with you. Here's my email. Here's my website. There is my LinkedIn. And we, of course, want to, again, thank our really fabulous PCA 26 sponsors. And I really appreciate all of you. If you do have some questions, then, of course, you can type them into Slack and we continue that conversation later. So thank you for everyone.
Thank you, Heather. This was great. As Heather mentioned, continue to chat on Slack, connect with her. This is a great session. It is just a starting of the conversation. And thank you all for joining.
Heather, this is Dan Corbin. I put a plug in the Slack channel for your session on Monday because I know this was you only had half an hour today. So if people want to attend on Monday, then hopefully we can kind of get to some of the questions. And obviously, I've been allowing people to ask questions when they RSVP. So and I think I shared that doc with you, right? Okay.
You're
I
talking.
muted myself. It's nice to see your face, and thank you for that.
Yeah, looking forward to it. We have over 100 people signed up, and I'm sure we'll continue to get even more. But I'm anxious to kind of share my story. A lot of times, I feel like people associate imposter syndrome with women. And I want to kind of be able to, at the kickoff, just say, hey, this is something that affects a lot of people, and share a little bit. I love the fact that you have the categories, and people really do. I've been talking to a lot of product managers and saying like, hey, which one are you? Because we talk about this how we struggle with this sometimes. And it does seem like people have a predominant one with a secondary one. So like, I'm a superhero with a dusting of the expert. So yeah, I think it's going to be a great session, and really appreciate you taking the time and talking to the Product League.
Yeah, of course. I will see you on Monday.
All right, have a great one.